And our first storyteller is going to be Sarah Tate. Sarah is a Carroll County public school teacher. She teaches 3rd grade. And she's also an artist. She does things in paper craft and has an Etsy shop. Sarah is an amazing person. She's been an incredible presence in this tellers group. She's the person who will sit there rather quietly and then a half an hour later says 5 words and shows you this incredible depth of wisdom. And so she's really taught me over the year the power of listening and the power of being able to take all of that in. The line or the piece of the story from this past year that's really stuck with me is that I learned from one of her stories that the phantom in the opera is sometimes that dark side of yourself that gets in your way of trying to achieve your goals, but you can move past that. So without further ado, I welcome Sarah Tate to tell her story.
Thank you, Melanie. Getting to know someone virtually can happen a lot faster than getting to know someone face-to-face. I, like most young people, have been on several online dating sites over the past few months. And at the beginning of March, I found Nick's profile. He was very cute, he was tall, had a shaved head and glasses. So I swiped right and we matched. He started messaging me and our conversation was very light. But as sometimes happens with online dating, the conversation petered off. When that happens, you know that it's just time to move on. So I assumed when I didn't get another message, we weren't a match, and that was it. About 2 weeks passed, and out of the blue, Nick messaged me again. How are you doing with everything with COVID? And in that 2 weeks of silence, a lot had changed. COVID had just kind of become a serious thing on the national stage. I'm a 3rd grade teacher, and my school had closed down for 2 weeks, and they had just announced that we were going to be closed for at least another month, that we were going to be teaching virtually. I had packed up my things and my cats and gone to my parents' house to quarantine with them so that I wouldn't be by myself during this time. So things were just very different than they had been the 2 weeks before. When Nick messaged me again, we moved pretty quickly into texting one another, and we had some very different kinds of conversations. Some of our conversations were very light, easy, the kind of things you would talk about on a first date. We talked about our star signs, which of course, when I found out Nick was a Taurus, I had my friend complete our star chart to find out our compatibility. We talked about our love of animals, the TV shows we liked. But we also had some very serious conversations, the kinds of conversations that you don't usually have on those first few dates. We talked about our personal struggles, our past relationships, and our wants and needs. And we very quickly became very close. The other thing that brought us together was the shared experience of living through COVID. Even though we were far apart and hadn't met one another face to face, we were experiencing the same fears. We were seeing the same things happen on the news. So it gave us another thing to connect over. As we grew closer, Nick and I started talking and texting all day, every day. It was easy to do this because we were both at home and had more time than we normally would have. We did this for 2 months. We talked and texted every day for 2 months, and our feelings grew and grew until we decided that we didn't want to wait any longer. Quarantine be damned, we wanted to meet. But in our meeting, we did want to be safe. So we decided to have a socially distant first date. This was different than any kind of date I've had before. We couldn't go out for drinks or for dinner or to the movies. We decided that Nick would come to my apartment, that I would clean, so it was very sanitized and safe, that we would socially distance, that we would wear masks when we weren't eating, and that would be the way that we could see one another safely. In preparing for this date, things are a little different than preparing for any other date. Of course, when you have someone over for the first time, you want to impress them. You want your place to be nice and neat, but this was beyond anything I've done before. I sanitized everything. When I made dinner that night, I cleaned the kitchen and sanitized after every step in preparing my shepherd's pie. The day of the date came. I heard a knock on the door, and I opened it, and there was Nick in his mask. My instinct was to step forward and hug him, but I knew I couldn't do that, so I backed up into the hall so that there would be 6 feet of distance for him to be able to come in. Fortunately, we very quickly discovered that we were as comfortable and happy with one another in real life as we had been virtually. Our relationship translated very nicely. So we sat on the couch on opposite ends, and we talked through our masks. It was tricky because we couldn't see one another's smiles. We couldn't hold hands, but we couldn't be close. But after that first date, socially distanced or not, we decided that we wanted to see one another again, and that this time we wanted to actually be able to interact, not socially distanced. So I decided that I was going to leave my parents' house, where I had been living with my parents, and my mom's a nurse, and was working through COVID. So I decided I was going to leave my parents' house and self-quarantine in my apartment for 2 weeks so that we could safely have an actual date. Those 2 weeks were a little tough, being by myself, but they passed. And the Friday night after those 2 weeks were over, I heard another knock on the door. I opened it, and there was Nick, this time with no mask, and I was able to go into his arms. I tell you all of this because before COVID, I didn't think it was possible to meet someone online and have feelings before I met him. I had friends who had met people over the internet and told me that they were in love with them before they had met face to face. And I have to admit, I was a little bit judgmental. I didn't believe that it was possible to love someone that you had never met in person. But what this whole experience has taught me is that there can be beauty and love and safety, even amidst a national pandemic, an international pandemic, and that it is possible to fall in love through a screen. Thank you.